Good morning. Before I begin, I might just move that out of the way. I'd just like to pray before I start. If you just close your eyes and bow your heads with me. Dear God, we just want to thank you that we can be here. What a privilege it is to gather freely and worship in your name. Lord, I just pray that my words may be yours. I pray that I may fade into the background and that you were revealed this morning. We love you so much. We're in awe of you. Thank you for loving us and for saving us. Amen. I'm pretty excited to talk about this story in the Bible in particular, because it's a story that I've loved since I was a kid. And the reason being is because most Saturday afternoons, when my parents would go for a Sabbath nap. Some Saturdays, we would be out on a hike or we'd be out, going on a walk. Our family loves our walks. But there were some Saturdays where you were just really exhausted from the week. And so my parents, they would take a nap, but us kids, we had all the energy in the world. And so what we would do is we would run to the living room, we would open up the cabinet where all the DVDs are, and there was always one DVD that was on my mind that I really wanted to watch. And I was someone who would overplay movies as a kid, and my sister, she would actually hide the DVDs that I would overplay as a kid. She would hide them somewhere, and so all of a sudden I had to obsess over a new favorite movie. But this was the one movie that both my sister and I loved, and for good reason, because the movie I'm talking about is The Prince of Egypt. The DreamWorks film, and it is a really beautiful film that they put together. It was very iconic for its time because of the soundtrack, the cast, the animation. And what's wild to me is that this film was actually being created at the same time Shrek was. And what would happen is if someone was, being silly, or if someone had made a mistake while working on Shrek, on The Prince of Egypt, they would get sent down to work on Shrek. Like the punishment for not working hard enough on The Prince of Egypt at DreamWorks was to go and work on Shrek, which is just so mind-blowing to me because it's a Christian film and it is a beautiful story. And my love for this story continued, this story about the Israelites in Egypt. It continued throughout my teen years. And when I was in high school, I went to a few high schools, but for most of my high school life, I was at a public school. And the only time I studied religion in high school at these schools was in my ancient history unit, or my ancient history class. And it was only for a term, and we didn't even get to study Christian religion. It was all religion, and it was ancient religion. And so for about 2 weeks, we looked at Judaism, which was the closest I ever got to actually being able to talk about Christianity in one of my classes as a subject. And for the assessment, we had to write an essay comparing two ancient religions. And so the two that I chose was Judaism and Egyptian religion, because you put them together and you get the story of Exodus. And I thought it was a really smart way for me to be able to engage with the Bible for an assignment in my public school. And I was really excited, and it was probably one of the better marks I got in that class, but it was because I was passionate about the topic. It was because I loved the story, and I loved researching into the archaeology of the Exodus and of the journey from the Israelites into the Promised Land. And I thought this was really amazing. And if I were to fast forward to now, I still have a love for this story. And I run a life group once a week with 3 uni girls. So there's 4 of us in total. And when I asked them, what do you want to study? What do you want to read? What do you want to learn? What do we want to discuss? They responded with, we want to read Exodus, which I got very excited. But the funny thing is when you read Exodus and you compare it to this childhood movie that you watch growing up, you realize that the book of Exodus kind of plays it on fast forward, and it misses out on all of the things that we would see in the movie. And so as we were reading it, it felt like we were rediscovering the story of Exodus for the first time again. And it was a really beautiful opportunity to be able to discuss this story that was basically being reborn in our hearts and minds as a group. And so this morning, I want to invite you to engage with this scripture. And if you have your Bibles, I'd invite you to turn to Exodus chapter 13. And we're going to be starting with this story. We're starting at verse 17, but before I do, I want to share my big idea for today. And if you forget everything, and if you forget everything that I share today, I just want you to remember this. God doesn't just save us from something. He saves us through something and for something. He doesn't just save us from something. He saves us through something and for something. We're going to unpack this today. So if you open up to Exodus chapter 13, we're going to start with verses 17 to 18. So if you would read with me. It says, "When Pharaoh finally let his people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus, the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle." So if you don't know where we are in the story, if you're unfamiliar with this story, the Israelites had been held captive. They were in slavery to the Egyptian nation for about roughly 460 years. So there are generations of Israelites who had been in Egypt, and for some of them, actually most of them, they don't actually remember a life outside of Egypt. And that's important because when you're reading the story of Exodus, you need to recognize that a lot of these people don't remember a life before Egypt. For many of them, all they know is Egypt. And if I were to connect the dots and connect some of the stories that we read about the Egyptian nation or the Egyptian kingdom in the Old Testament, I would think, okay, but Joseph, years before that, he was an Israelite and he was in Egypt and he held a pretty important role. Like, he was famous in Egypt. So what about that? How did the Israelites get to such a place when someone else had already gone before them and created such a name for not only Israelites, but their God? But what we only know if we read the Bible is that there had been so much time that had passed since Joseph, which is basically the end of Genesis, by the way. So there was so much time between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus that many people didn't even remember Joseph's name. Many people didn't even remember what he had done. So for these Israelites, no one had ever fought for them. No one had ever gone before them on their behalf. All they knew was slavery. That was life. For generations, all they knew was Egypt. And this is important because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the story, for the rest of the book, really. God chose the long way around. And this wasn't to frustrate them, but to protect them. So in verse 17, when God leads them out of Egypt, and if you know the story well, you know that for a long time, Moses kept going to Pharaoh, asking him, you need to release my people. You need to let my people go. He was going on behalf of God, with the power of God, begging him to let the Israelites go. Because God had promised deliverance to the Israelites. And after a long negotiation, which is a whole other sermon in itself, but after a long negotiation, finally, Pharaoh had reached his breaking point and had said, leave. I want you to go. Take your people and leave. And so as they leave, as they leave Egypt, God decides not to lead them the direct route to the promised land, their promised land for generations. Instead, he takes them the long way around. And there was a reason for this, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at first glance because you think, well, why not just go the fastest route? They had been in slavery long enough. Surely you would just get them to where they can be their own people. But God took them the long way around. And it was for a reason, because if we reread in verse 17, it said, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. You have to remember that this was a nation that only knew slavery. They had never been to battle at this point in time. Not this group of Israelites. We read later on through the Old Testament about this mighty Israelite army who fights many battles and are victorious. And yet, this group of Israelites, all they knew was how to take orders. All they knew was how to be a slave. And so God knew that if he led them the fastest route to the promised land, they would have to face a battle that they weren't ready for. So yes, it doesn't make sense to go the long way around, but it does because God could see what was ahead of them. God knew that yes, this would be frustrating and this would be a long journey, but it was to protect them. The Israelites had not yet seen God fight on their behalf. They weren't the mighty Israelite army we read of in the Old Testament just yet. They were slaves who hadn't had anyone fight for them. And even though they left Egypt like an army ready for battle, it was only an appearance. They were not yet ready to face an enemy. Sometimes what looks like a delay is actually protection. And I'm going to say this again. Sometimes what looks like a delay is actually divine protection. Our God is a God of rescue. We might wait years for deliverance from areas that we feel we are held captive, whether that may be fear or hard relationships or difficult living situations or physical or spiritual poverty. But deliverance will come. And it might not look the way we expect it to look, but it will make us better because it grows our strength and our character and our faith. I like to think of it like a GPS, and I've recently learned a lesson with my GPS because last week I preached a sermon in the LDC, and I was sharing about this analogy about how a GPS often shows you the quickest route. And it's because it can pick up on traffic or hazards in the road. It can pick up on delays that you might not know about. And so it'll find an alternative route. And as I was preaching this last week, I actually said, I don't know if I can really relate to my own analogy because sometimes I like to think I'm smarter than my GPS, and I'm not too sure my GPS actually knows the fastest route. I think I know these roads a lot better than it does. And yet, I learnt my lesson very fast. This week, we were at ministers' meetings at the conference office. And as I was leaving my street, I like to have the GPS on so I can know my ETA. And it was telling me to turn right. But I know if I turn left, I'm going to go on the most direct path that'll lead me to the motorway. That's where I need to go. But it was telling me to turn right. And I said, there's no way I'm going to go right. That's the long way around. I need to make sure that I go left because I want to get there on time. I had actually left a lot earlier because I was going to meet up with a friend. And I'm glad I had made that plan with her because what happened is what I didn't see ahead of me that my GPS did see ahead of me was that it took me about 20 minutes to get onto the motorway. I was stuck in traffic from the moment I turned left. And I had no idea that it was so busy on that road. I should have gone right, but I went left because I thought I knew the road so much better than my GPS. So I turned left. I ended up being so much later than I had originally planned to be. Not that I had planned to be late, but so much later than I had originally planned to arrive. And I learned a good lesson because the next day when my GPS told me to turn right, I turned right. And yes, I still got stuck in traffic on the motorway, but I didn't have to wait an extra 20 minutes in traffic just to get there. Because I couldn't see the hazards and the traffic ahead of me that my GPS could. And the reason I'm sharing this analogy is because we think about our relationship with God the same way. Because God can see what is ahead of us in ways that we can't. He can see what's ahead of us, and when we think, God, I know you are almighty, and I know you're all-knowing, but I think I know what's the quickest way for me to get where I want to be. I think I would know. And I know you know everything, and yet, what if I just did it my way? What if there's a quicker way that I can think of myself? But sometimes God takes us the long route because it's not to frustrate us, but it's divine protection from something that we cannot see. He can see ahead of us. And sometimes our delays in life can frustrate us. Sometimes we can sit in a delay and think, I'm not where I wanted to be. I have a friend who loves to ask every year when we have a Christmas dinner, what's your 5-year plan? And every year my 5-year plan is not what my 5-year plan is. Well, it turns out to be. So I've just stopped guessing what my 5-year plan is. And every time she asks the question, I say, skip me. Because I cannot path out the next 5 years of my life the way God can. And I've just lent into him being the GPS of my life because he can see what the best route is for me. God's detours are still deliverance. Even when the path seems uncertain or hard, God is present, he is leading, and he is faithful. We're going to keep reading, and we're going to skip down to verse 21. Chapter 13, verse 21, and it reads, "The Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people." There's something really cool about this. Because I remember sitting at home and learning about the Exodus as a kid, and I remember picturing this pillar of cloud or pillar of fire leading the Israelites through the desert. But what never really hit me until I was a lot older is that even in the middle of the desert, God provided visible and constant presence. Because the thing is they were begging God for deliverance. When they were in Egypt, they were begging God for deliverance. And God could have saved them from Egypt and then said, okay, you guys are free. Now go be Israelites. Go and be fruitful and be merry. Like he could have just said, okay, you're free from Egypt, now go. Go and do life. But he didn't, because the problem is that for these Israelites, they actually didn't know life outside of Egypt. They didn't know how to be a people. They didn't know how to be a nation with their own identity and with their own God. And God didn't just abandon them in that. Yes, God saved them from Egypt, but he continued to save them through the desert. And he stayed with them for the next 40 days and 40 nights. 40 years. A lot longer than 40 days and nights. For the next 40 years, God's presence was constant. God's presence was constant. This pillar of cloud and pillar of fire would be the Israelites' constant company for the next 40 years. God was present with them in the desert, leading, guiding, the whole time. I like to think of it when you ask someone for directions, or when you arrive at church for the first time and you're new and you don't know anyone. And in particularly, let's think of Springwood for a moment, with 2 services running at the same time. It's a bit unique. And if you were to arrive not knowing anything about our church, and you get greeted by someone at the door and they say, welcome, and it's a very warm welcome, and it's really great. It makes you feel very at home. And you ask them, okay, well, where's the youth Sabbath school? They could point and say, oh, it's just this room over here. And that's really lovely. They give you directions. It's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing. But there's just something different. So sorry, Richard. I think I keep hitting the thing. I'll try not to move my left arm so much. But there's a difference between giving someone directions and taking them there yourself. When someone comes alongside of you and says, hey, let me take you, I'll walk you there. Because it makes sure, they're making sure that you get to where you're going and that you're not alone. You don't get lost along the way because you're trying to figure it out yourself, or if you've forgotten the directions that they had given you. And it's the same. He could have been like, if you head in this direction, you'll get to the promised land. But God instead said, let me take you there. I'm going to guide you through the desert to the promised land. When we feel spiritually dry or lost, we need to look for the pillar of God's presence in our own lives. And they are present. We might not have a pillar of smoke or a pillar of fire leading us through our individual lives, but his pillar of presence is present in our lives. We can see God's presence through these pillars like his word. His word, which literally gives us directions in life. That literally gives us the advice and directions that we're looking for. We can look for pillars in his spirit because his spirit is here among us and present, and his spirit does empower us, and it is an advocate for us, and he does give us, and he is with us. And we can also see his pillars through people, through community. Sometimes when you need that extra person or that extra community to guide you and help you through life, we weren't built to be alone in life. There are pillars of God's presence in our lives today. His presence is just the same as it was in the desert because he is leading and he is guiding us. We don't believe in a God who sits on his throne and has nothing to do with us. We believe in a God who cares, who is present, and who does not leave us. He tells us, I think around 365 times in the Bible to not be afraid. And if that's enough for once every single day, then why should we be afraid knowing that his presence is always with us? We're never alone. He will not leave us. We're going to keep reading through chapter 14, and we're going to jump down to verse 10. 14, verse 10, and it says this. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness." But Moses told the people, "Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm." This is probably the most just relax speech I've ever heard. Because they had finally been free from Egypt. They had finally felt assurance and rest in their mind as they start their journey through the desert. And then they turn around and they can see the Egyptians headed straight toward them. So they start to panic. And they're worried. And they're not sure that they're going to make it out alive because in their minds, they're not ready for another battle. They have not experienced life outside of slavery and Egypt, so they take it out on Moses. Even though they were the ones praying for deliverance in Egypt, they were the ones knowing that there is a life so much better for them, but they needed God to deliver them from Egypt. But in this moment, they start dreaming of being back in Egypt. And the part that breaks my heart the most is when they say, it's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. The people panicked when Pharaoh pursued, but Moses called them to trust. This complaint that they start complaining to Moses with, this is the first of many complaints of what was to come. In their 40 years in the desert, this was just the first of many complaints that they would bring to Moses. Complaints about how God was leading them, where God was leading them. Complaints about their circumstance, which is wild to me because it was around 460 years in Egypt, and it was only 40 years in the desert. But throughout that journey, they kept comparing to Egypt, saying we were better off in Egypt. Instead of believing that God, who had demonstrated his power so overwhelmingly, could now save them, the Israelites turned on their rescuer. The cry of the unsurrendered heart is always, give me the security of slavery rather than the risk of faith. And I'm going to say that again because this breaks my heart, and it's something that I just feel is so real. It says, the cry of the unsurrendered heart is always, give me the security of slavery rather than the risk of faith. I want to ask you today, what are you a slave to? Because this remains true just as much for us as it did for the Israelites while they were in the desert. While the Egyptians were creeping up on them and their unsurrendered hearts were crying out for Egypt, it remains just as true for us now. What are you a slave to? What are you so afraid to let go of, and instead of stepping into a life of faith? What are you so afraid of letting go of that is holding you back to taking a risk of faith in your life? What are you bound to? Are you crying out for Egypt? In the middle of your story, it might look messy, but it's not the end. You have to trust God's bigger picture. And so when I ask, how do you respond to difficulty? Do you respond with positivity, and are you the kind of person that makes a plan and creates a way? Or maybe you're just like me, and your response to difficulty is anxiety and discouragement and doubt. Fear can be loud, but faith is so much louder. We're going to keep reading. Verse 15. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will charge in after the Israelites. My great glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots, and his charioteers. When my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am the Lord.' Then the angel of God, who had been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. So just picture that for a moment. Before, God was leading them through the desert, and now this pillar has moved in between Egypt and the Israelites. He has placed himself between the enemy and his people. Just keep that in mind, this picture of God standing between you, his people, and the enemy. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and Israelites did not approach each other all night. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on each side. Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. "Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." When all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, "Raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers." So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh, and all of the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea. Not a single one survived. And then this is it. This is the important part. Verse 29, "But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground. As the water stood up like a wall on both sides, this is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. And when the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses." We had just read about how their fear was so big it started to consume them. And now they've seen this mighty feat from their God fighting for them when no one else had fought on behalf of them in years. Now God is fighting on behalf of them. They didn't have to lift a finger, exactly what God had said would happen. And not one of the Egyptian army had survived because God had delivered them when they thought that they were at a dead end. God makes a way where there is no way. God's salvation often comes in miraculous and unexpected ways. So when you're stuck between an army and a sea, look for God's hand. There's some times in life when we feel like we've reached a dead end, when we cannot see a way out. And we start to think these same thoughts that the Israelites had thought. If only I was back where I was, I wouldn't be where I am today. If only I was back in Egypt, I wouldn't be stuck at a dead end with no way to survive. But God can make a way where there is no way. Your dead end isn't necessarily a dead end because you have God on your side. God is in your corner. God doesn't just lead us into dead ends, he leads us through them. And so I want to share this again. God doesn't just save us from something. God hasn't just saved us from where we were. God hasn't just saved us by sending his son to die for us. It doesn't just stop there. God continues to deliver his people. He saves us through something. He saves us continually through the desert that we may be feeling like we are traveling. When you feel like you were traveling a dry desert and you're feeling like you're going the long way around and this isn't the most direct route, God is still delivering you. And he's not just leading us through something, but he's delivering you for something, for a purpose. Because you are so much more to him than you could imagine. And there's something, but my last sermon in this church, I shared about how there's something really cool about knowing where you come from, about knowing your family history and knowing about what your story is. And church, I want to tell you that this is your story. This isn't just a story about the Israelites leaving Egypt. This is a story about you, about how God has saved you and is continuing to save you. And he has saved you for a reason. This is your testimony. I want to share about something really special, something that I've had the honor of being a part of over the last few months. And Abby, I hope you don't mind if I put you on the spot. But I've had the pleasure of doing Bible studies with Abby Holgerson for a few months now. I think we started last year. And it's been an incredible journey. But it's been one that's been a long time coming. And I was approached by one of the pastors at EMP Church, which is where Abby serves at Pathfinders. She's very active in her Pathfinder club there. And one of the pastors reached out and said, Gabby, I need you to follow up this baptism request. Because one of your church members, one of your church youth, has told me that they'd love to be baptized. And so when he reached out, I got excited and I thought, oh, this is so exciting because there's something really cool about hearing from someone young say, I want to give my life to God. And what an honor to be a part of it. And when you know the background of her story, of how her and her mom have traveled to Australia, and really a lot of her family are still in Sweden. Did I get that right? Still in Sweden. She has so much family here still. And it is a testament as a church, for those of you sitting in this room, it is a testament for the community that you've built around her. Because this is something that she has done in community. The way that she has gone on this journey, and I've been really lucky to be a part of that journey. And it has been a long time coming. I've chatted with her chaplains at school. And as I was chatting to Annalise, she said, this has been something that Abby has been talking about for a long time now. But there's just never been like this moment where we could just finally make it happen until now. Which is so exciting. Like, this is something that she didn't just make a snap decision. This is something she's been thinking about for a while, and I feel inspired by her story. And she's going to share her story at her baptism this afternoon. It's definitely not one to miss because I feel it's a story that we can all relate to and see ourselves in. But it is a testament to know that someone so young is so on fire for God, loves God so much, and actively already serving in her church. But the thing that inspires me the most is when we've gone through all the studies that we need to go through. She's a very smart and brilliant person, and so a lot of the time she asks me questions and I have to go back and do some researching and talk to Pastor Dane and get a bit more info because she's got a very brilliant mind, and she asks some really great questions. But one of my favorite questions is she asks, so how do I continue my journey with God? How do I keep my relationship with him alive? Because life can be a bit like this. But she's like, but I want to know, like, what can I do to keep it alive? What can I do to feel like I'm still connected with God, even when life feels a bit like a dry desert, or when life feels like I'm going the long way round, or when life feels like I'm in a delay, or when life feels like I'm at a dead end? How do I do that? And I love that she asks this question because I think it actually says a lot about where she is at and the maturity in her relationship with God. Because I love the conversations we get to have about that, how God doesn't just save us, but he continues to save us. This is a continued journey. And so after today, Abby isn't just going to be baptized and then that's it. After today, Abby's going to continue on her journey with God. And God will continually deliver her and continually save her and lead her and guide her through different seasons in life. And so I want you to reflect on your own story. I want you to reflect on your own desert season. Where does it feel like you're waiting or wandering or stuck? I want you to reflect on this. Where does it feel like you're waiting, wandering, or stuck? Do you feel like you're at a dead end at the moment, where you're not really sure what's next for you? Where you feel like I've lived life, but what's beyond that? Like, what is left for me? What have I got left to give? Or maybe you feel like you're in a delay. And maybe you feel like God has led you the longest way possible to get where you need to be. And maybe the place that you're trying to get is a completely different place to where God is leading you. Where does it feel like in your life that you are waiting or wondering or stuck? And what might be God doing in that space? We need to look for his hand when we feel like we are stuck. We need to look for the pillars in our life of God's presence. And when we do, I want to ask you, what story will you tell when you look back? Is the story that you tell going to be, I wish I was back in Egypt? Or is the story that you're going to tell is that my faith is so much louder than my fear, and that God is and has and always will be leading me somewhere great? What story will you tell when you look back?